So the first and foremost question is, what does this expression, securing digital boundaries, mean? Because in the physical world, it is very clear, there is a boundary, everyone knows where it is, and securing it is something which you can physically see and satisfy yourself, and it's all very visible. But if you look at the digital medium, then this is not the case at all. In fact, in the digital medium, which is a completely global medium because of the internet, the flow of data, and not only data, the flow of value generation from that data are massive. They are global, they are seamless, and they are pretty much instantaneous. So it is fundamentally different in that sense from the physical boundary. The second point I want to lay out at the outset, and my apologies to those for whom all this is very, very fundamental, but I thought that in a mixed group, it may be good to set the foundation. The second aspect is that the data and the value which I talked about flows through several layers. There's a telecom layer, there's a software platform layer, there are applications, and then of course, you have firewalls and encryption and so on, which are there spread out all across this medium. And within this, you have lawful interception by states and unlawful interception by hackers. All of this exists in this medium, and we have to take cognizance of that. Now, if you look at the physical infrastructure, you have telecom hardware, you have computers, you have IoT devices within the country, which are physically located within the country as far as the digital space is concerned. But if you look at the virtual parts of it, the software platform, the software management, the updates to the software, the hardware management, all of this in today's world are typically done remotely, and that remotely can be from a different country and often is. So that's another dimension that we need to keep in mind. If you look at hardware manufacturing, for example, both telecom hardware as well as today it is driven by global supply chains, very well connected and highly efficient global supply chains. And they have three characteristics. One is very high volume because it's a global volume, very high velocity because the movement is very, very fast. Typically the inventory is only of a few hours, not even days, and forget about months. And it is low margin in most cases, except of course where you have a very proprietary product and some unique technology involved. So high volume, high velocity, and often low margin is the other important characteristic of a lot of this hardware. Now, the other implication of this is that all countries in this space are interdependent. And this is without exception. This includes the US and it includes China. And it is therefore a myth to think that any country is completely autonomous and is able to be completely independent and self-contained. So against this background, what does the expression securing digital boundaries mean? That is the first question that I thought we should first look at. And to my mind, firstly, the data which includes digital data, and we are talking in this context only about digital data. So data and digital data which relates to Indian citizens and originating in India from transactions in India belong to the country, which has a natural right over it. I think that should be taken as a starting assumption. But let me also elaborate that a little bit. So consequently, all the data and all the value addition to that data should be subject to the laws of India. So these data that I talked about needs to be subject to the laws of the country. I'm choosing these words carefully because the value addition does not always accrue to the country. So that these two are not interchangeable. So the value addition does not accrue to the country, but it is subject to the laws of the country. I think that's an important distinction that has to be kept in mind. So basically, securing digital boundaries to my mind, means ensuring that the laws of India apply to such data and to the value addition that arises from that data. And within this are contained issues like privacy, individual data security, national security, taxation, and of course, the foundation of it is the jurisdiction of the country in addressing such disputes, any kind of disputes. It also means that access to data, when required by the government in accordance with the provisions of law, should be possible without being subject to the laws of another country. The key word here is access, not possession or location. Sometimes there is an illusion that if the data is located here, then that means that it is entirely under our control. But because of the reasons that I just mentioned, that is not always the case. The data might be subject to control from elsewhere. It might be subject to encryption. It might be on a platform which you have no access to. So the key question is about access, and that is what the focus has to be. Location is only one aspect of it, but not the be-all and end-all of it. So what is the purpose of acquiring this kind of control when we are talking about this sovereignty? Number one is that the purpose of acquiring such control is to ensure that by formulating suitable policies within the country, we can maximize the economic benefit to the country and to its people from the digital economy. Maximize the economic benefit to the country and its people from the digital economy, but subject to security and privacy considerations. These are not completely independent variables, and sometimes there is a trade-off between these, and at such points, a conscious decision has to be taken after considering all the factors. So when we talk about securing digital boundaries and achieving this kind of control, we have to keep in mind control over all the layers, the telecom layer, the software platforms, the apps, and wherever firewalls and encryption are involved. And to acquire such control, one needs to have adequate foothold in each of these layers. Now, this adequate presence or adequate control does not actually mean complete indigenization or erecting walls and saying that no one can come in. In fact, in the strange digital world, with the strange laws that it has, that can actually make you more insecure in some cases and not more secure. So how do you become self-reliant in this kind of an environment, and what does that self-reliance actually mean? Because self-reliance is still important, but it does not mean a complete autonomy from everyone else outside or preventing anyone else from outside from coming in. So if you look at the data economy, which is linked to value addition, which is linked to technology development and innovation, which in turn are linked to IPR. So the data economy runs on value addition, technology development and innovation are linked to IPR. And you look at issues like security, privacy, taxation. All of these will need to be bound together in an economically sensible and rational manner. And to the extent that the laws and regulations ignore the economic forces as well as the global ecosystem, the chances of those laws being effectively implemented definitely becomes much lower. So we need to look at the enforceability and implementability of the laws given the complexity of this medium. So let me explain all of this. I've given it in a very theoretical and abstract way, but let me take two specific examples because it is not possible to cover the entire range of areas that I outlined. But two examples I think will suffice, one in the case of the hardware and the other in the case of the software. Let's take the example of 5G telecom equipment, which today is much discussed all across, and especially in the context of the recent Chinese incursion, as well as the dominance that they have achieved in the telecom space, especially companies like Huawei, which by many accounts actually have the most advanced technology in 5G and at a very, very competitive rate, making them a fearsome competitor on the global arena. And given the kind of vulnerabilities that I had mentioned, which arise at all of these layers, and telecom is the foundation, it's the base on which it rests. So if that is vulnerable and that is susceptible, then we are obviously going to be significantly compromised in terms of national security. It's also important to understand that it's not as if it is only with Chinese equipment that we will be vulnerable. We will be vulnerable with any equipment of any country, but vulnerable maybe in that towards that company and possibly towards that country if the company is working in close tandem with their own government. So, from a national security perspective, and the current in the current context, obviously, allowing Chinese equipment or Huawei equipment to come in is seriously jeopardizing our own security. But we should also keep in mind that what are the consequences of not allowing it and how do we deal with those consequences? Because not allowing it seems almost an imperative at this point. In the world today, as all of us recognize, there are no friends. At the end of the day, you are on your own and you have to rely on your own capabilities and strengths. So the moment you shut out what could be the cheapest or the most competitive option, immediately the benefit and advantage will be taken by others who are in the fray. And therefore, you need to have a strategy to ensure that you are not taken for a ride in terms of economics, because at the end of the day, for India, we are a very price-sensitive country. The whole telecom revolution in India would not have happened if we didn't come to the current price point. So we need to have a counter strategy for that, and building indigenous capability is a big part of that. While doing so, I think we need to keep in mind two things. One is that the standards that have to be followed will need to be international standards in order for all of this equipment and all of this infrastructure to be interoperable globally. And there is a whole set of dynamics which goes into international standards and how those are influenced, etc. But that's a much bigger game in which a lot of big companies and countries are involved. But whatever it is, we are a part of the world and we cannot sort of go away from these standards and island ourselves. Otherwise, we will not even have the benefit of global volumes, we will therefore not have a lower price, etc. So that's one aspect. So how do we really get a foothold in this area where we have very little, capability at the moment? We do have significant capability. I want to make it clear that there are some very good companies in India and some good public sector organizations which have a strong capability. But taken together, they don't straddle this entire space, and therefore we have vast gaps in our capability. And definitely in the area of 5G, we need to look at what those gaps are. Secondly, we need to be careful by looking at claims of 5G technologies and see whether they are comprehensive, because 5G can be actually defined in many different ways, and you can say that something is 5G covering some parts of 5G but not all of it, because that's the way in which 5G with complete integration with the applications and users operates. So we should, I think, be very discriminating while looking at that from the point of view of what is it that works in the best interests of the countries. And from my perspective, I think we need to work with some allies to navigate this space. First, we need to look at those Indian companies and organizations that are in India, in the public sector as well as in the private sector and overseas, and how this strategy can be built with their involvement, participation, and inputs. Because at the end of the day, as was said by one of our earlier WTO trade negotiators, putting walls does not help companies which are not yet born. It only helps companies which are already there. So we need to work with the companies which are already there as the first layer. The second layer is to look at companies, foreign companies which are here in India, because a lot of them are actually, they're all in fact led by Indians whose heart beats for India. And I have seen in my interactions with them that many of them are prepared to help. They may be working for a foreign company, but they are here in India. And, it doesn't take a whole lot to discern who our friends could be over there. So that's the second concentric layer that we can actually count on. And the third is Indians in foreign companies, people of Indian origin. They may not even be Indian nationals today, but they occupy very, very important positions. And that is an asset. How we use and leverage that asset is a question, but that's the third concentric circle. So we need to look at some of these strengths and then build our strategy, based on these three concentric circles. This is just one example of the complications involved in hardware like 5G. Let me turn to a different example of e-commerce platforms and the commercial aspect, and how enabling and enhancing the digital economy and the digital economy. And e-commerce is a very good example of how the wheels of the digital economy function. And it brings up all the issues of startups, of competition, of platform economy, of the network effect and all of that. And how do you foster, the key question for us should be, how do you foster the growth of the digital and the data economy in all sectors of the economy? In agriculture, in banking and financial services, in healthcare, in education. And what should our policies look like to maximize that growth and the value to the country? So here again, there need to be some very important trade-offs made. And again, since we cannot shut ourselves off completely from the world, we need to look at the dangers of different kinds of companies and the kind of monopolies that they might acquire within the economy. And I do want to mention that dominance of the market per se is not bad. If you look at competition law and competition theory also, dominance per se is not bad, but it is abuse of dominance, which is, and especially abuse of dominance which causes injury to consumers, which is harmful, and that's where the CCI comes in. But if I were to put a hierarchy to all of this, the worst situation would be to have a foreign monopoly in the country, which is completely where the market is completely dominated by one company, and that's a foreign company over which there is no control. But equally, even if it's not a foreign monopoly, even if it's a domestic monopoly, I think the dangers are quite substantial. And to some extent, if you have competition, even if it is foreign competition or a mix of foreign and domestic competition, that could arguably be a better situation than being completely in a domestic monopoly. And then, of course, there are other layers like state monopoly and only domestic companies competition. But our goal perhaps should be to ensure that there is adequate competition, because that is the best protector of consumer interest. If you look at the pre-liberalization economy, I believe that what was harmful was less the kind of protectionism which was there and more the prevention of competition because of the licensing Raj. And if we had encouraged all-out domestic competition with free movement of technology, then we might actually have been in a better place, even under such a restrictive regime. If you look at the regulation today, there's a lot of emphasis on personal data protection. Now you have a committee reporting on non-personal data protection, which has stirred up a hornet's nest because it is ignoring certain fundamental economic dynamics and arguing for making available data at no cost to both the government and even to competitors, which I think definitely is not in consonance with the way economic forces work or the way the data economy works. Then one more example I just want to refer to briefly is that if you look at the hardware, sometimes we are focused on getting visible hardware manufacturing in India, but if the value addition is not significant, then I think we need to ask the question as to how relevant this is. If you look at mobile phone manufacturing, for example, uh, even if we have a substantial mobile phone manufacturing, and we do have it, it's good. But how much of support we give, how much of money we pour into it, I think is a big question. And while some amount of protection and growth is important, government offering huge subsidies in those areas at the cost of other areas which might better be supported with that money certainly does lead to a question of what the trade-offs or value judgments are. A last point I want to make is that a lot of this data actually is vitally important because a lot of the new technologies are built on data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep, big data and data analytics. All of these rest on that. And we therefore need to figure out how we actually either create the IPRs or have a mechanism in which we do it jointly with partners where each one has a stake in it and has a share in it. None of this is possible in the digital space unless we have the necessary strength in research. And one of the weaknesses that we have had as an economy and as a country has been the very, very low research spend of most companies. And, even in the government, the research spend has been limited. In this area, a lot of the research actually happens in the private sector. So that's something we need to think about. But a key aspect in this is that in many countries, critical technologies in the digital area have come because of defense demand. And currently, our defense requirement, notwithstanding being one of the largest importers of the world, is very loosely connected with the private sector and is by no stretch of imagination a driver of research in the private sector. Thankfully, that is changing now under the current set of policies, but still very slowly. And I do worry that there isn't adequate clarity as of now in terms of how exactly this dynamic will work out. But I think we are headed in the right direction. So the bottom line of all of this is that securing our digital boundaries is critical, both for our economic as well as our national security. But in today's world, it's a complex issue, and one needs to approach it with a clarity on the definition, a clarity on the ends that we are trying to achieve, and by means of a carefully calibrated strategy which is based on alliances and partnerships. Whom can we trust? Whom can we build a long-term partnership, which is not based on dependence, but which is based at one level on trust and alliance, but at another level, having a gun to each one's head so that you can't completely, pull the trigger and without harming yourself. That's the way in which, in today's interdependent world, these alliances are built up. But our laser-sharp focus has to be on continuously building national capability across the spectrum of digital technologies, either ourselves or through these carefully structured partnerships.